It is one big club. For a long time, I have argued that the establishment is still protecting Prince Harry. At this point, I have to ask, did he ever really leave? Today, I am presenting what I believe is explosive proof that the BBC misled me. This is our national broadcaster, funded by the public, and I believe it provided false information in an effort to protect Harry and help rehabilitate his public image. If anyone at the BBC disputes what I am saying, I would simply point to the emails and documented paper trail that I will be showing throughout this episode. So, grab your popcorn and let's get started. I have the emails, and I am going to display them on screen because this is not a matter of opinion or interpretation. It concerns a specific statement made by a named BBC employee in response to a direct question I asked about Prince Harry's reported £1.1 million donation to BBC Children in Need. When the story first emerged last September, something immediately felt off. Much of the investigative work I do happens behind the scenes, and while not every lead turns into a story, this one certainly did. I contacted the BBC seeking clarification about the donation. If you've followed this channel for a while, you'll know I've previously discussed how, during Harry's UK visit last September, I believe the establishment surrounded him with a carefully managed narrative. What do I mean by that? I believe his public appearances were strategically focused on charitable causes, particularly children, placing him in front of audiences as a philanthropist. In my view, this wasn't accidental. It created an emotional narrative that made people feel guilty for criticizing him. Rather than seeing negative headlines or controversial behavior, the public was presented with carefully staged charity engagements. One of the biggest headlines claimed that Prince Harry had donated £1.1 million to children in need. As we now know, that was not a personal donation. During that period, I openly criticized what I saw as an attempt to mislead the public. When I read reports claiming Harry had personally donated £1.1 million, I submitted a formal request to the BBC. The amount itself immediately caught my attention. Having previously worked in the charity sector, I've seen celebrities use charitable donations to improve their public image. A donation exceeding £1 million guarantees headlines, and even when converted into other currencies, it still carries the powerful £1 million donation message worldwide. I end my email to the BBC. I asked a very specific question. Was this a personal donation from Prince Harry, rather than money distributed through Archewell or another charitable organization? I asked because I already had reason to question the way the donation was being presented. At that time, Harry's work opportunities appeared to be slowing down, while there seemed to be a renewed effort to improve his public image. On March 20th, the BBC replied in writing, stating, "I can confirm it was a personal donation from the Duke of Sussex." According to the information that has since emerged, that statement was incorrect. The money reportedly came from the Glenegg Foundation, a charitable entity that holds funds inherited from Princess Diana. In other words, the donation did not come directly from Harry's personal bank account or personal wealth, but from an existing charitable structure linked to his mother's estate. Many celebrity estates operate in a similar way, placing inherited assets into charitable foundations where investment income or accumulated funds are later distributed to charitable causes. While I cannot confirm the exact financial structure of the Glenegg Foundation, it appears broadly consistent with that type of arrangement. What makes this situation even more significant is that the BBC itself would have had records showing exactly where the money originated because it processed and received the donation. That is why this episode focuses on 3 key issues.
The £1.1 million donation was presented to the British public, as well as audiences across the Commonwealth and around the world, as an act of Prince Harry's personal generosity. According to the speaker, that was not the case. They argue that the national broadcaster confirmed what they believe was a false version of events in writing after they directly questioned the BBC. They also raise concerns about the timing of when the truth eventually emerged and why it was revealed only later. The speaker then takes viewers back to September 2025, when Prince Harry arrived in the UK for what they describe as a carefully curated series of charitable appearances. They argue that this has become a familiar strategy for both Harry and Meghan, claiming they frequently position themselves behind philanthropic causes and charity work. During that visit, Harry traveled to Nottingham, where he visited the Community Recording Studio, a BBC Children in Need project that supports young people affected by violence. The speaker finds it particularly noteworthy that Harry chose to work so closely with the BBC. They go on to reference Prince William's previous public criticism of the BBC's handling of Princess Diana, particularly the controversial Martin Bashir interview. According to the speaker, William has spoken openly about the way the BBC treated Diana and the lasting consequences of those events. Because of that history, the speaker believes Harry's decision to publicly associate himself with the BBC should not be overlooked, arguing that every public appearance on the world stage carries symbolic meaning, especially when it involves the king's son working so closely with the broadcaster. During his visit to Nottingham, Harry watched a rap performance and embraced one of the young participants. As expected, the event was extensively photographed and filmed. The speaker remarks that there always seems to be a camera present, along with carefully placed branding boards, to capture warm, positive moments. They also recall that Royal Rota photographers covered the visit, while much of the mainstream media suddenly published unusually positive stories about Harry. The speaker suggests this favorable coverage did not happen by chance, but instead reflected a coordinated effort from senior levels, even speculating that it may have been encouraged by the king. They also question why media outlets that Harry has previously taken legal action against would suddenly present him so positively. The discussion then returns to the announcement of the £1.1 million donation to BBC Children in Need. According to the speaker, the wording used at the time was extremely important. They claim Harry's own team explicitly stated that the donation came from his personal funds and specifically distinguished it from the Archewell Foundation. The BBC reportedly repeated that description, leading to headlines describing it as one of the largest personal charitable gifts ever made by a modern royal. The speaker argues that portraying the donation as Harry's own money was what transformed the story into major international news, rather than a routine charitable contribution. The speaker broadens the discussion by arguing that philanthropy has often been used by high-profile public figures to improve or protect their public image. They reference several controversial celebrities and public figures as examples, claiming that charitable work can sometimes redirect public attention away from criticism and toward a more compassionate image. In their opinion, some celebrities use philanthropy primarily to enhance their own reputation, rather than to serve charitable causes. They add that, in their professional opinion, both Harry and Meghan have used philanthropy in ways they find concerning. The speaker also explains that both they and their husbands spend considerable time researching online harms, particularly those affecting children. Because of that work, they say they are especially cautious about sharing children's photographs online, particularly with the rapid rise of unregulated artificial intelligence. They express concern that once images are online, it is impossible to know how they may be used in the future. Finally, the speaker says they are pleased to have documentary evidence to support their investigation. They explain that whenever something does not seem quite right, they instinctively begin asking questions. They jokingly describe their thought process as being like a constantly active mousetrap, an observation they say their mother often makes. According to the speaker, their background as a former gatekeeper in the media has taught them how false narratives can be promoted or prevented, making them particularly sensitive to stories that do not seem to add up. The speaker explains that, based on their experience, they understand how real news can be shaped before it reaches the public. They argue that framing is everything, and the way this story was presented immediately raised concerns. Rather than asking a vague question, they say they contacted the BBC directly on March 20th, 2026, with a very specific written request. According to the speaker, they emailed a BBC representative named Henny, asking for clarification about the reported £1.1 million donation. They note that they have redacted the email address from the screenshots only to avoid any issues with the video being removed, but describe the emails as part of their documented audit trail. In the message, they specifically asked whether the £1.1 million had been received as a personal donation from Prince Harry, rather than through the Archewell Foundation or any third party. They emphasize that they explicitly mentioned both alternatives in the email and display the correspondence on screen for viewers to read themselves. The speaker says the BBC replied the very same day with 2 emails. The first confirmed that the donation had been received in full, while the second reportedly stated, "I can confirm it was a personal donation from the Duke of Sussex." The speaker stresses that the reply contained no qualifications, disclaimers, or wording such as "to the best of our knowledge." Instead, They describe it as a direct and unequivocal confirmation that the donation was personal. They then highlight what they consider the most important detail. At the time they sent the email on March 20th, 2026, they say the Glenn Begg Foundation story had not yet become public. They insist they were not writing to the BBC with prior knowledge of the answer. Instead, they simply questioned whether the narrative surrounding the personal donation was accurate because the reported amount and its presentation did not seem convincing to them. According to the speaker, the BBC chose to confirm the personal donation on the record. Addressing viewers outside the United Kingdom, the speaker offers their personal opinion of the BBC, criticizing the broadcaster and stating that they no longer pay for a television license or watch BBC programming. They argue that canceling their TV license was the right decision for them and encourage viewers who are undecided to consider doing the same. Returning to the donation, the speaker argues that the BBC should already have known the true source of the funds. They claim the transfer from the Glenn Begg Foundation to BBC Children in Need had been recorded with the Charity Commission on October 10, 2025, making it a matter of public record. By the time they sent their inquiry, they say those records had been publicly available for approximately 5 months. Because the BBC received and processed the donation, the speaker believes the broadcaster would have possessed documentation identifying the entity that supplied the funds. Therefore, when they specifically asked whether the money came personally from Prince Harry or through a third party, they argue the BBC nevertheless confirmed it as a personal donation. The speaker then turns to what they believe deserves the greatest scrutiny: the role of the mainstream media. They argue that misinformation and disinformation remain widespread, expressing skepticism toward Prince Harry's public comments about combating false information. In their opinion, the Glenn Begg Foundation records were never hidden. Instead, they say the information had been publicly available through Charity Commission filings since October 10, 2025, meaning any journalist or researcher could have located it with sufficient investigation. According to the speaker, despite the information being publicly accessible, no major media outlet reported it for approximately 9 months. They conclude by criticizing what they describe as the modern news cycle, joking that much of the mainstream media simply republishes official palace press releases with minimal independent investigation before presenting them as original news. The speaker asks viewers to consider the significance of the reported £1.1 million charitable donation, which was widely described as one of the most generous personal gifts ever made by a modern royal. According to the speaker, public Charity Commission records identifying the actual source of the funds had been available in a searchable register the entire time, yet no major mainstream news outlet reported that information for almost a year. The speaker notes that the story eventually emerged on June 19th through an article by Richard Eden in the Daily Mail. They then explain their own view of Eden's role within royal reporting. While emphasizing that their comments are not personal, they describe him as someone with close ties to palace sources and suggest that he often publishes stories that either amplify or quietly manage narratives originating from within the royal institution. They point out that Eden serves as the Daily Mail's diary editor and is closely associated with the publication's Palace Confidential coverage. According to the speaker, Palace Confidential represents the opposite of what they aim to provide on their own channel. They argue that Eden has long-standing access to senior palace thinking and is regarded as one of the best-connected royal correspondents in the country when it comes to establishment sources. In the speaker's opinion, many of his exclusive stories could only have originated from individuals close to the institution. As a result, they believe he is unlikely to publish information that runs contrary to palace interests without approval. The speaker therefore questions the timing of the Glenn Begg Foundation story. Rather than asking how Richard Eden discovered publicly available information, they argue the more important question is why it appeared when it did and who benefited from its release at that particular moment. They suggest that the timing coincided with renewed public attention surrounding Prince Harry's return to the UK, ongoing reconciliation stories, discussions about his security arrangements, and a broader narrative portraying him as someone connected with healing, both within his family and through charitable work. Drawing these points together, the speaker argues that the BBC, a publicly funded broadcaster supported through license fees, provided them with inaccurate information regarding the donation. They contend that the broadcaster's written confirmation helped reinforce Prince Harry's public image, while information challenging that narrative remained publicly available, but largely unreported for months. The speaker further argues that the eventual publication of the story in Richard Eden's column minimized public attention rather than encouraging widespread scrutiny. The speaker concludes that they have lost confidence in both the mainstream media and what they describe as palace insiders, arguing that official narratives should not automatically be accepted at face value. They state that they will continue presenting documentary evidence and paper trails to support their investigations. In their view, the available records demonstrated that the donation was not a personal payment from Prince Harry, leading them to believe that elements of the establishment worked together to improve his public image and facilitate his public rehabilitation. Finally, the speaker tells viewers that they believe additional evidence will emerge in the future, particularly surrounding Prince Harry's return to the UK beginning on July 6th. They predict that upcoming media coverage will strongly support the rehabilitation narrative they have described and argue that it will differ significantly from the investigative approach taken on their own channel. The speaker thanks subscribers for supporting their investigative work, encourages viewers to subscribe and share the channel, and says they intend to continue examining public figures regardless of status. They close by reiterating their central claim, that the British public was presented with a story of Prince Harry's personal generosity and sacrifice which, in their opinion, was misleading, and that Princess Diana's philanthropic legacy should not be used as a public relations tool.